I'm just going to grab this photo and I'm going to head into my edit module. And I'm just going to go down into my tone and color and I'm going to click auto. It's just to set sort of a basic look for our shot. So there we have it. We have a basic look for our photo. And now we need to go in and we need to start adding some different filters to it. So to add filters, we need to go into Effects. All of our filters live in our Effects tab. When we want to add a filter, we can add filter. And now we can go over all of these different filters. A great way to learn about the filters is to use this little dialog that pops up. You can simply hover over each filter and it will give you a description of that filter as well as a before and after with that filter applied to it. So if you do get lost or you're kind of confused on what filter does what, just kind of hover over them. It'll give you a basic idea and then you can go in and just kind of play with the sliders. But for now, let's go over some of these filters a little bit more in depthly. Let's start with this first one, which is Antique. So let's just add Antique onto our photo. Okay, so we've added the Antique filter onto our shot and it's kind of doing what the name says. It's giving our image an aged look. Well, the Antique filter is similar to the Vintage filter, except that the Antique filter focuses more on monochromatic looks and less with color. So with the with the Antique filter, you're going to get more of a monochromatic, antique aged look on your shot. And you can go in and you can modify any of these different sliders in here. Now I like to start out, especially if I'm adding a new filter, I just like to play with these preset styles. I'll usually just click on this More Styles, and then I'll just kind of hover over these and see what they do. And I really like that neutral one, so I'm going to keep that on my shot. Now that we've added that neutral style in here, it's chosen all of these details for us. But that doesn't mean that we can't go back in and modify any of these sliders. So we can go in and we can choose a different color. I'm actually going to leave it at this Moscow one. And you can also modify your brightness, your fade, and your saturation. So if you want to make this filter a little bit bigger, you can just pull up on your brightness. Or a little bit brighter, sorry. A little bit brighter, you can just pull up on your brightness. And if you want to give it more of a faded matte look, you can simply pull up on your fade slider. You can also add in some color with the saturation slider. And you can modify your film grain. So if you do want to apply film grain, you can do that in here simply with these sliders here. So that's a little bit on the Antique filter. Let's close out of that one. Let's add our next filter. And this is a popular one, black and white. And the black and white filter does what it says. It changes your color image into a monochromatic one. Now, what a lot of people don't know about the black and white filter is how to actually modify it to create a black and white look on your shot. So if we turn this filter off and on, let's take a look at the colors in this image. I would say there's a ton of blues and there's a little bit of yellow and green. So if we turn this black and white filter back on, and now if I go down into my color response area here, I can actually pull up or down on these colors to give them a bright or dark black and white look. So if I want to increase the brightness of my blues, I can grab this and I can pull up on it, and this will brighten up those blues in my sky, or I can make them darker by pulling down on it. Also over in this area were those yellows and greens. So we can grab our yellow slider here, and if I pull up on it, you'll see that it's pulling up on the brightness of those green and yellow areas. I can do the same thing with the greens. So then if we click these back to 0, see how it took away a lot of that effect from the areas in our sky and in our trees? This is because inside of this black and white filter, it's basing the black and white conversion off of these values that you use for the different colors. One of my favorite preset styles in here is this red preset style. And you'll notice right down there that I actually changed the conversion mode to channel mixer. Well, that just means that you can go in and you're actually modifying the preferred color in here by just using this hue slider. So you can either specifically choose the colors that you want the black and white to respond to, or you can use this channel mixer to use this one slider and do it for you. Another cool thing about the black and white filter is that you can modify the tone, the toner, and your film grain. So if you want to brighten areas in your photo, you can go down into your tone, and let's just go back into our color response, and we'll leave it at red. And now inside of our tone area, let's say we want to pull up a little bit of the brightness in this photo. Well, we can just go down and pull up on the brightness. We can even pull up on the shadows if we'd like, the details, and you can add in true black. So there's a lot of other sliders inside of this black and white filter that you can use to modify the look of your shot. You can also modify the toner. So if you do want to go in and modify a little bit of the split toning in this photo, you can give your photo, you can give your black and white photo a little bit of tint to it. So let's say you want to add in a little bit of, let's do a sepia look. We can click on the sepia look here, and now we can go in and modify the different colors for our highlights. The different colors for our highlights and our shadows. And we'll talk about more of the split toning with the split tone filter, but this is just to give you an idea that you can actually do that inside of the black and white filter. Also, black and white wouldn't be where it is without film grain, so we can actually add film grain if we'd like to also. My favorite is this, where's it at? Kodak T-Max 3200, just because I really like how grainy it gets. And then we can go in and we can pull up on the amount to give it more film grain, and then we can also make it a little bit bigger as well. So now if we turn this one filter on and off, it's brought in some nice black and white. It's actually a little bit too bright, so I'll turn this down a little bit. There we go. But it's brought in some nice black and white. We've modified the tone of it using these different sliders, and we've added a split tone filter and some film grain. So there's a lot that you can do inside this one black and white filter. It's not just about making your photo monochromatic. Okay, on to the next filter here. Okay, go add filter, and the next filter we're going to talk about is this Bleach Bypass filter. And a lot of people get confused on the Bleach Bypass filter because they're not really sure what it does. Well, the Bleach Bypass filter harkens back to the film days when you actually had to process film with bleach. So this filter is emulating that look without the bleaching process applied to the film. This basically reduces the saturation and increases the contrast on your photo. So if I turn this Bleach Bypass filter off and on, you'll see it decreases the saturation, removes some of that color, and then it increases the contrast, gives it a little bit of a moody look. Another filter that's pretty similar to this is actually the Grunch Filter. But with this Bleach Bypass filter, some of my favorite preset styles are this lighter preset here, because it brightens up the photo, all while kind of removing some of that color and adding contrast. And then I can go down in here and I can modify the amount, I can modify the brightness, I can play with the contrast to add or remove, I can add detail, and I can also bring in a little bit of tint. So you'll notice that this photo is pretty cool and there's a lot of blue in the shot. Well, if I want to add in a little bit of warmth, I can just use this tint area down here. I can pick a color. Let's just pick maybe a green. Pick like a darker green. And then we can go down into our amount area, and if we pull up on it a little bit, it'll bring in some of that green color into our shot. So that's Bleach Bypass. Great for when you're kind of wanting to remove some color, give a little bit more contrast, add sort of a moody look, I would recommend using Bleach Bypass. Okay, so now we're moving on to the next filter, which is our blur filter. And for this filter, I'm going to grab another photo. I'm just going to pull up my film strip view by hitting F on my keyboard. And I'm going to grab this nice little portrait. Wait till it loads so it doesn't yell at me. Okay, now I can go into it. All right, so next filter we're going to add is going to be the blur filter. And the blur filter is awesome for, you guessed it, adding blur to your photo. What I like to use the blur filter for is removing distractions and also creating a nice depth of field in my photo. So let's say for this image, the background around here is quite blurred, but let's say we want to soften it up even more and bring a little bit more focus onto her face. Well, let's go and we'll turn that blur filter back on. And I'm just going to pull up on the amount quite a bit. And now all I'm going to do is I'm going to hit B on my keyboard to grab my masking brush. I'm going to make sure that I'm set to paint out and that my opacity is 100. And now I'm just going to brush this blur from the model. And then I can go up and I'm just going to lower the opacity for this brush. Just going to kind of paint it on these areas. Boom. So now let's go over to our blur. And if I pull this back and pull it all the way up, we can maybe pull it back a tad. But if I turn it off and on, you'll see you can actually kind of soften up the area even more behind your subject just to bring a little bit more attention onto the subject's face. You can also modify the different blurs in here by going into the different type. One of my favorites is this radial blur because it gives kind of a look like you were zooming in with a telephoto lens. So if I turn this off and on, again, does a good job of kind of bringing us into this little middle section where our viewer or where our subject is at. So I'll turn that one off. Let's add another filter here. And now we're moving on to borders. So the borders filter is great for applying borders to your shot. So if you want a border on your photo, which I'm just going to say this, probably every photo ever looks best with a border around it. A white border makes everything look amazing. So if you want to add a border, just click on the borders filter here, and then you can use these different categories to choose which kind of border you want. They have a bunch of them in here. There's digital, you have some film ones. I typically like to stick with this simple one. And then I usually go into my border option and I'll choose white square. That's kind of my favorite one. But there's other options down here also. So if you want to modify the tone and color of your border, you can do that by just using this slider. And because my border is white, it's not showing me any of those adjustments. But if I want to colorize this border, so let's say I put on a white border around this photo, but I want to colorize it, I can click on the colorize option here. And I can use this color dropper tool. And I'll just drop it on a nice, we'll use this orange or brown. Boom. And then I can actually pull back on the amount to apply as much or little color on it as I want. Another great feature down here is you can actually transform. So if you want to make the border smaller, you can use this scale to do that. Or if you want to make the image bigger in your border, go down to Fit Image and just pull up on it. And then you can make it realistic size before you put the border onto it. All right, moving on here. Next filter is the color adjustment. Okay, the color adjustment filter is an awesome filter for when you're wanting to modify specific colors in your shot. Anytime you're looking to target really specific colors, I would go with this color adjustment. So let's say for this photo, for example, these greens and yellows behind her hair are a little bit too strong. So if we want to kind of tone those down a little bit, what I like to use is this color dropper down here. And within this menu, we can choose to either adjust the hue, the saturation, or the brightness. I'm going to choose adjust saturation. And now if I click on this, I'll just click on an area that I want to, or an area of color that I want to tone down. I'll just click on it and watch as I drag to the left and the right. I can specifically target those colors in this photo and either add color or remove color. So I'll just remove a little bit of that color. And now let's say we want to go in and we want to brighten the color in her eyes. Well, I'll just go into this color dropper, adjust saturation, click on it, and now I'll just increase the color in her eyes. And we'll turn up the brightness a little bit. So now if we zoom down here, it might be better on her dress. But now if we turn this off and on, actually let's go down here and we'll do a better color one. So let's say we want to brighten the blues in her shirt down here. I'll just reset this color adjustment. And I can either use this color dropper to select the blue down here, and I can brighten it up or remove color. Or I can just go in to these colors, and if I hover over it, it'll tell me the color. That one's blue. So now I can use all of these different sliders to adjust that color. So if I want to make them less saturated, I can pull back on the saturation. If I want to increase the brightness, I can do that, or I can make it darker. I can also modify the range so it brings in more or less color. And I can modify the hue. So if I want to make it more of a baby blue, or I want to make it more of a purpley blue, magenta, I can do that with this hue slider. Okay, so I have a question for Michael. Can you show for what is the range value and color adjustment? So with the color range, this is basically telling ON1 Photo RAW how much of the color blue you want to modify. So let's just reset this again. And I'll go into these colors over here. And let's use this again. And we'll drop this down kind of all the way. And now let's say I want to modify the range. So this is just going to select the range of colors that I want to edit. If I hold down Option, oh, never mind. Okay, so that's only on the skin retouching. So this basically is telling ON1 Photo RAW how much of that specific color do I need. So you'll watch as if I pull back on the range, it's removing some of those unsaturated colors. But if I pull up on it, it's bringing more of those colors into this filter and making them desaturated. So this is basically just telling Photo RAW how much or how little of one color that you want to modify. I hope that answered your question, Michael. If not, definitely type it in. I'll try to do a better one. Okay. So, let's do a different photo here. And where are we at? Let's see. Let me see what filter we're on real quick. All right, we're on color enhancer. So we can do color enhancer for this photo. So we'll add a color enhancer. And kind of the only difference between the color enhancer and the color adjustment is that within the color enhancer, you have all of those basic color modifiers that you do inside of develop. So inside of our tone and color inside of a develop, we can correct our white balance, we can modify temperature, tint, saturation, we can reduce vibrance on skin, and we can modify the purity for our highlights and our shadows. If we go into effects, inside that color enhancer, we have all of those same options, but we still have our color range selectors like we did inside our color adjustment filter. So you'll notice that if I open this color enhancer and I go down here, it's the same as my color adjustment. Basically, with Color Enhancer, you get all of the other tools that you can use to modify white balance, your temperature, and kind of warm or cool your photo. So for this photo in particular, I just want to correct for my white balance. And it looks basically good, but if your photo is either too warm or too cool, I would recommend using this Color Enhancer if you want to correct for color. This way, you can go in and you can modify the temperature to either cool it down or warm it up. You can use your color dropper to go in and correct for white balance. Oops, I must have slicked on the blue. So let's zoom in here, and there'll be some white somewhere. Oh, whoops. Okay. Let's see if it works up here. That's better. Okay. So now you can use the color dropper to go in and correct for your white balance. And that made it a little bit too green, but that's fine. We can go in and modify it. And also, let's say you're modifying a photo with a person in it, and you don't want their skin to be oversaturated. Well, make sure you go down into this area and choose Reduce Vibrance on Skin. This is going to make sure that if you do pull up on the saturation sliders or the vibrance sliders a bunch, you're not bringing in a bunch of color onto their skin or their face. Also, down here in Purity, if we do want these areas in the background or the foreground to be a little bit less saturated, we can pull up on this Purity for our highlights, and this will desaturate some of the color in our highlights. Or if we want it in the shadows, we can do that with this slider here. So this is basically giving you kind of an in-depth look at all of your colors so that you can modify the white balance, the temperature, sort of anything that has to deal with color inside your photo. Okay, let's do one last filter on her, and we're going to do the cross-process filter. And the cross-process filter basically, again, goes back to the film days, and this is when they were using the wrong chemistry and wrong chemicals deliberately so they could get a different sort of unique look on the photo. It basically mixes colors, it gives a bunch of contrast, and makes some wonky looks. And so as you see, if I turn this cross-process filter on, it's pretty crazy. It's basically bringing out a lot of awkward colors and crazy colors in the photos. But the great thing about using these filters in Photo RAW is that you can always lower the opacity and blend them onto the image. So regardless of how strong this filter is, I can always go up and I can lower the opacity to make it look more natural. And honestly, some of these cross-process filters, or the preset styles in here, like especially this, not here, this yellow one, it really looks awesome on portraits, especially if you pull back on the opacity of it a little bit and then go and add a little bit more contrast. Watch as I turn this off and on. Doesn't that make for a nice kind of warm, summery look on the photo? So a lot of these filters in the cross process are going to be pretty crazy, and they're not going to bring on a nice mellow look on your photo. But because you do have the options to go in and modify any of these sliders in here, you can always make it look good. Just like with this yellow one, and I do like this other, what is it? Blue Strong. And I usually go in and I'll lower it to about, 25. I'll remove some of the contrast, and I'll bring in some brightness. And now if I turn this off and on, brings in a nice bit of color to my photo and a little bit of a cool look so that it's not just so warm. So that's cross-process. If you're confused on what to do in cross-process, just start grabbing different looks and start modifying these sliders, and eventually you'll come up with a cross-process look that you like. Okay, so now it's time to grab another photo. And let's just grab this one here. Yeah. As it loads. There we go. Okay. So I have this photo here, and I've just, like with all of the photos previous, I've just set sort of a basic look to it. So I just have, a few sliders. And I'm just going to use this effects tab again. I'm going to add a filter, I'm gonna add the curves filter. Sorry, I got interrupted by a coworker. Okay, so now I'm gonna do basically a basic modification to this photo. With this curves filter here, it basically gives you all of the ranges within your photo from complete black to midtones to highlights. So if you look at this tone curve, basically your blacks are down here. So all of your blacks and your black point, the darkest dark in your photo is right down here. And as you go up, it's shadows, so you have your shadow areas in here. And then you have your midtones, so you have your grays, your light to mid grays in here, kind of your mid tonalities in your photo. And as we creep up here, it strays away from the midtones, and then we get more in our highlights, and then we have true white. So just think about it as sort of a line graph going from dark to light. And then you can modify and pull around on it to pull out some of those different tonalities. So for this particular photo, let's say I want to pull out some of the shadows and I want to boost the midtones, but I don't want to compromise the exposure. Well, an easy way to do that is with your tone curve. So if I want to pull up on the shadows, I can do that by just grabbing the shadow point down here. And you'll see that that pulls up on those shadows in my photo. And now if I want to pull up on the midtones a little bit, I can do that by grabbing in my midtone area, and I can just pull up on the midtones a little bit. But you'll see that I made my photo a little bit flat. So I can go back down into this area, and if I grab on one of these points, and if I pull back on it a little bit, I'm then pulling down on the blacks and the shadow areas, and that's incorporating contrast into my photo. So you'll see that I pulled up on the midtones, I pulled up on my shadows, and then I brought back a little bit of contrast by pulling down on my shadow point. Now I can go up to my highlight area, and I'm just going to pull back on the highlights a little bit. Boom. So now if we turn this off and on, we've brought out some of those tonalities in our photo, and we've kind of given our photo a little bit of a boost. Another cool thing that a lot of people don't know about the tone curve is you can actually use your tone curve for specific colors with red, green, and blue. So let's say you want to bring in, or let's say you want to take out some of the blue from your shadows. Well, we can grab our shadow point on our blue tone curve, and if we pull it down, watch how that removes all of the blue from those shadow areas. So if I turn this off and on, see how it brings in a lot more of that green warm color into those shadowy areas? That's just because we're pulling down on the shadow point down here on our blue line. But let's say we want to bring in some red to the highlights. Well, we can go to our red, and we can pull up on this point, and it'll bring in a little bit of red into our highlights. So then you can kind of play with the photo a little bit and play with these curves to really kind of dial in what sort of look you want. Let's close out of that one. We'll move on here. All right, we're on to the fan favorite, and that is dynamic contrast. This is probably the most popular filter in all of Photo RAW, which understandably, it's an amazing filter. It basically brings in micro contrast and detail into your photo. So if you want to bring in detail, definitely use this dynamic contrast filter. It's an awesome filter for doing that, and it allows you to play with, all of the different sizes of detail in your photo. What I like to do with dynamic contrast is I've actually gone in and I've put these sliders to 0, and I've gone into more, and I've actually saved this as a new style so that I can go in and 0 these out. That way, it's all at 0, and I can start from scratch and start modifying these sliders. When you first open up the dynamic contrast filter, however, it's going to set you at natural, which is an awesome preset. It's probably the one you're going to want to stick with because most of the time it looks natural. But for this particular photo, I'm just going to zoom in here, and I just want to give you guys an idea of sort of the different sizes in these sliders. So this first one here is small. So this is basically going to adjust the really small areas of micro contrast. So watch as I pull up on this, and it brings in a lot of detail into these smaller areas in my photo. So this is great if you're looking to bring in some micro contrast onto rocks, reefs, anything that's, small and has a lot of detail. Fruit, things like that, product photos. Now let's do medium. So if we pull up on medium, you'll see it brings out a lot of that micro contrast, but it's not as small as the small, obviously. So you're basically just modifying these different sliders for the different areas that you want to be boosted with detail. So if I go back and I'll put this back to 0. And now if I pull up on the large, you'll see that that's mainly bringing out the detail in the large areas of contrast. If I pull up on this and I go into this ocean, this is where the large is probably going to be at play the most. See how that kind of brings in detail to these larger areas of micro contrast? And now if I went back and I went to the small, it's not bringing out as much detail because it's trying to go into these really tiny areas of detail and bring those out. So let's just go to natural, and I'll pull up, actually zoom out so you guys can see it. And I'll pull up on my small a little bit. And if I turn this off and on, it does a good job of bringing in some detail to my photo. But what a lot of people don't use inside dynamic contrast is this little tone area down here. So you can actually modify the tonality of this by using this tone area. So if you want to bring out some of the shadows, you can do that. Or maybe pull out some blacks, bring in a little more vibrance. You can do that all while in this dynamic contrast filter, which really helps, especially if you're modifying a specific area. So for this dynamic contrast filter, for example, let's just invert this mask. And now let's brush this on the areas that we want it to be applied to. Oh, we're only at 48%. Make sure your masking brush is at 100 if you're trying to demo to a bunch of people. Okay, so now we're at 100% and we've brushed this on. It looks a lot better. But watch as I go down here and I modify these different sliders. So it really gives you kind of complete control of wherever you're looking to apply detail in your photo. It helps you apply detail to the shadowy areas if you want to pull up on the shadow tones, the highlights, whatever it may be. You can do that using this dynamic contrast filter. Okay, so John Clark asks, if you adjust tone in the dynamic contrast effect, can it only be changed in that effect, or can you also change it in the develop module? So anytime you apply a filter, the only way to modify that filter is inside of the effects tab. So none of these filters that you apply inside of effects are going to be editable inside of develop. It's all going to be done in whatever tab you applied them. All right, so moving on here. Thanks, John, for the question, though, by the way. Okay, we're on to film grain here. So film grain's an awesome filter. We just added it actually recently, a couple months ago. And it's just kind of what it says. You're adding film grain onto your photo. So let's zoom in here, and let's say we want to add some film grain. Well, I can just add a filter. I'll add film grain. And again, I'm going to go into this preset area with all of the different films. And I'm going to choose one so you guys can really see how strong it is. There we go. And now once we've chosen our film, what we can do is we can modify the amount and then the size. So if you want more film grain, pull up on the amount. And if you want larger grain, go down to the size and pull up on that also. And then you can kind of fine tune that film grain for yourself. Now I might have not really mentioned this in the beginning since we were kind of going over the look of the filters, but if you are wanting to save styles and you want to go into these more and have your own styles in here, just click on this more option for any filter you apply, literally any filter, click on the more, and once you have different settings adjusted, just select Save New Style. And then you can add in a new style, and then you can go back and apply that to any of those different filters that you use. But yeah, so that's the film grain filter, just applying film grain. Okay, so now what filter are we on? Glow, awesome. Okay, so let's go back. And I'm actually going to grab a different photo here. Grab this one. And I grabbed this photo because we are adding a glow filter onto the shot, and glow, in my opinion, works really awesome on water. It almost looks like a polarizer. So I'm just gonna crop this shot a little bit. I'm sorry guys, I thought I cropped it earlier. That looks pretty good. Okay. So now let's go into develop here, and I think it all looks pretty good. We'll just use ON1 landscape, and then we'll go into effects. We'll add a filter, and we're gonna add the glow filter. And the glow filter basically does kind of what it says. It brings in a nice glow to your image. And like I was saying earlier, it does an awesome job on water because water normally doesn't have to be too detailed or crunchy. Well, one of my favorite preset styles in here is this more and charge more subtle. I don't know why, but for whatever reason, it really looks good on water. So if I turn this off and on, you'll see how that brings in a little bit more detail and contrast to this water while also softening up some of the areas. Well, I don't want that applied to this top area. So a quick way to use your gradient mask is just to hit M on your keyboard. So apply a filter. If you want that filter to be applied with a gradient, hit M on your keyboard. Now I have my masking gradient selected. And I'm just going to drop this on the water line. And now if I turn this glow on and off, you'll see it brings in a nice little bit of glow into the water here. Well, let's actually go and we'll do lighter, just so you guys can kind of see. There we go. That's a better example of what glow does onto your photo. Oops, choose the wrong overlay. And then you can modify the amount to bring in more of the amount, more haloing, whatever you want to do. And it'll kind of just continue to bring in some of that glow look. Great for water, great for softening up areas around your photo. That's the glow filter. All right, moving on to the next filter here. All right, we have grunge. The grunge filter, kind of self-explanatory again, brings in sort of a moody, grungy look to your shot. And it's pretty similar to Bleach Bypass, in my opinion. It basically reduces the color and increases contrast, which gives you a moody look. One of my favorite presets in here is this lighter preset, just because it does bring in some light, but it also has that same moody feel. And then you can go in and, just like Bleach Bypass, you can go in and apply more amount, more brightness, saturation if you want. You can bring in more detail. Another cool thing about this is you can actually add in some glow. So if you do want to bring in a little bit of a mood to your shot, but you also want to bring in, some sort of glow look to it, you can do that by using this glow slider down here. And watch as I bring in a little bit of glow. And I'll actually go in and I'll click lighten. There we go. And I really like how this glow kind of adds to like the fog look of this photo almost. Brings in a little bit more of that glow and haze in here. And then I can go in, and if I want to bring in some film grain, I can do that also. All right, moving on here. And now we're on HDR look. So for HDR look, I'm actually going to grab a interior photo. Oops, over there. I think it's this one. Oh, no, this one. There we go. Sorry, tons of photos, guys. I tried to pick a bunch of good ones for each sort of little filter that we were going through. Okay, cool. So I have this shot, and if you were with me last week, we actually modified this live. But the reason I grabbed this photo is to show you guys HDR look, because HDR look looks awesome with interiors. So let's add a filter and we'll add HDR look. You're basically creating an HDR look where everything is in focus and everything has detail, and also all of the different exposures and tonalities all mesh together, and you can see everything without there being a bunch of harsh details. So with this HDR look filter, we can go in and we can modify the compression, which basically is telling ON1 Photo RAW how much of this photo do I want to see all of the shadow and highlight details. So if you pull up on the compression, you're telling ON1 Photo RAW that you want to see more of those details. You want to see more highlight shadow detail. Whereas if I pull down, it's going to make it look more like a natural image. It's going to bring in more contrast back to that photo. Another cool thing about this HDR look is you can bring in detail, but you can also add clarity. So if you're confused on whether you should add an HDR look filter or a dynamic contrast filter, I would add a dynamic contrast filter. More often than not, this HDR look is going to bring in a little bit more crunch than you like. And with the dynamic contrast filter, you can go in and modify it a little bit more to your taste. You can modify the small, large, and medium sizes of the contrast, whereas in HDR look, you're basically modifying your detail and your clarity without any specific information on where that's going. Also, you can modify your highlights and shadows. It's sort of like the dynamic contrast filter without being able to modify small, medium, and large. So you'll see you have your tones down here. You can modify your shadows and your vibrance. We can also bring in some glow if we like, or we can bring in some grunge to bring in some of that moodier, less saturated contrast look. I would just stick with natural, or if you're modifying a real estate photo, you can stick with surreal, and then you can go over it and lower the opacity to make it natural. Okay, so we'll move on from this photo, because that was the only one for HDR look. And next we have lens blur. So let's grab this shot here, and let's just... Okay, so actually had it there. Hopefully you guys didn't see that, but it was already applied. Okay, so we'll add a filter, and the next filter is lens blur. Lens blur is an awesome filter. This brings in lens blur to your shot. So if you have a subject, for example, if I turn this lens blur filter off, I have this subject area over here. Well, I want to soften this area of cars, but I don't want to do it with a regular blur. I want to make it look realistic. So what I can do is I can use this lens blur. I'll pull up on the amount quite a bit, maybe about there. And then I'll just use my masking gradient again by hitting M on my keyboard. And I'll just drop that down. And now as I flip this around to the other side where my subject isn't, I can use my feathering There we go. And now if I turn this off and on, we can probably pull back on a little bit. But it does an awesome job of really accentuating this subject area in here and kind of removing those areas as focal points for the viewer. Also inside lens blur, you can modify the optic quality, which basically that's telling ON1 Photo RAW how sharp you want the bokeh to be in the background. You can modify the sides, your curvature, which is basically the curvature of the blurring in the background. Your blooming. The blooming is actually going to modify how bright the highlights are in your background. And then you have brightness, contrast, and then if you have noise in the photo, like we do in this one, you can actually pull up on that, and it'll remove some of that noise in your image. Okay, so Ken asks, what's the difference between blur and lens blur? So blur and lens blur are two different filters because lens blurring is different than blurring in the sense that when you shoot a photo with a camera and you're using a lens, if something is out of focus, it's going to be a different blur than if you blurred something in Photoshop. So let's say, okay, we'll turn this filter off. We'll add a blur. And now let's do the same thing. So this is just strictly blurring my photo using a Gaussian blur. Notice how it doesn't look as natural at all as this other lens blur. It's basically just using the other blurring modes taken from Photoshop to blur up pixels in your photo. And there's all these different kinds. So there's Gaussian, motion, radial, surface, and box. And all of these are basically used more for graphic design than anything. But you can also use them on specific areas in your photo. Let's say you need to blur out a little object or something like that. These work great for those things. But if you're trying to make or emulate a lens blur, I don't know really any other way to put it, but if you're trying to emulate a lens blur or a blur that you would have taken with a photo, I would definitely use the lens blur. The other blurs are basically for creating specific looks and kind of blurring out specific objects, or, like I said, using them in Photoshop to blur specific things. Okay, so now we have lens flare. All right, so lens flare is probably the one filter that I touch never. And it's not because I don't want to add lens flares to my photo, but it's that I don't want to add lens flares to my photo. But if you want to add lens flares to your shot, add a filter, and we can go into lens flare here. And I typically go to my type, and I choose sunspot. And I usually go up, and there's these different modifiers that you can use to modify the amount and the amount of rays in there. I'm going to go down and I'm going to pull up on it. Oops. Okay, so let's restart here. When you add the lens flare filter, I usually go into my type, I click sunspot, but now I need to center or position my lens flare. To do that, go down here and select this little star icon. Now you can drag your lens flare or sunspot anywhere on your photo. I'm just going to put it right in the middle up here so I can kind of emulate that look. Now I can go over and I can modify the amount to make it stronger or less strong. And I can also modify how many rays are in this lens flare. I'll do about right there. Another cool thing is you can also modify the tint. So if you wanted a different tint, let's say we wanted a nice colorful tint or something like that. We'll do Slurpee. Well, we can pull up on the amount and it'll bring in more colors into the sun ray. Let's use oatmeal. There we go, the oatmeal's working. And I can modify the fade. I usually tend to pull back on the fade because then it removes a lot of that fade between these rays. And then I go up and I'll usually just pull back on the opacity a little bit. And now if I turn this off and on, does a good job of bringing in some nice sun rays onto this photo. So if there is a photo, it happens where you need to put on a sun ray or a sun flare, or a sunspot, sorry, you can just do that by adding a lens flare filter. Okay, so we're moving on here. Let me grab another shot. Cool. Okay. So for this particular photo, I chose it just because it's going to be an easy one to apply style to with LUTs. So sorry again, gang. I'm just going to crop it. There's a ton of photos and I didn't get to cropping all these. Okay. So now I'm just going to develop and I'll just use ON1 Landscape like I usually do. Boom. Now I'm going to Effects. We'll add a filter. And this is, if you've watched any of my webinars, I'm sure you guys know that this is my favorite filter. This is the Luntz Filter. And the Luntz Filter is awesome because if you don't know what a LUT is, it's a lookup table. So a lot of people use them for color grading film and modifying color in like Adobe Premiere and things like that. But they work great on photos because they bring in and they pack a lot of style with them. So a Luntz filter, basically you're going to apply a Luntz filter and now you have the category that you can choose from. And then you can go in and choose the different LUT. I'm just gonna go into these cinematic ones. And I really like this Forest Park one. So watch as I turn this off and on. It's created a nice stylistic look onto my photo. There's not many things you can modify within the LUTs and themselves, just because they do pack a whole bunch of style onto one photo. But you can go in and you can modify the contrast and the saturation. So you can bring in color or you can remove detail. All right, so let's add another filter here. Oh, we're moving on. Next photo. Okay, so our next filter is sort of a maintenance filter. Oops, I already applied it to this. There we go. Okay, so our next filter is sort of a maintenance filter, I like to call it, and it's your noise reduction. So if you have noise in this photo, I know up here looks pretty crappy, but if you look in here, it's really noisy. There's a ton of noise. I don't know if you guys can see it that well because we are, doing a webinar. But if you can, it's quite noisy because I shot it at about 2000 ISO. And it was with a Canon 5D Mark III, which I'm not very impressed with their low light capabilities. So I switched to Sony, and I've had a great time with them so far. Anyway, okay, so let's add a filter here. And we'll add noise reduction. And now I'm going to click strong. And I'm actually going to go down to my luminance. And I'm going to pull up on all of these sliders just so that I can kind of show you guys what it does. And it may not look very good, but it gives you an idea of what noise reduction does to your photo. So if I turn this off and on, can you guys see that? How that kind of takes away some of the noise in your shot. It's basically going in and removing some of those granulated areas, because more often than not when you shoot low light or you shoot at high ISO, you're going to get some sort of noise. So if you do come into that, add a noise reduction filter, and there's all of these different preset styles in here that you can use. Just keep in mind that these sliders are going to correspond with the area that the noise is in. So if you have more noise in a very colorful area, pull up on that slider and it will remove some of that noise from the colored area. If it's more in areas that are a little bit brighter, like your highlights, this can do that and remove some of that noise. And then if more noise is inside of the detailed areas in your photo, use this and it will remove them. All right, moving on here to photo filter. And this is one of my all-time favorite shots of all time. One of our gurus, Maxim, shot it. And this is literally, if I just real quick, guys. This is a raw photo. That's the raw shot he took. And all I usually do is go in and I pick ON1 landscape. And it's pretty much done. Anyway, just had to point that out. Okay, so let's go into effects here. And let me just actually pull up on the exposure right here. Now you guys can see it a little bit better. Cool. So we'll add an effect here. We'll add filter. And the next filter we're going to go over is the photo filter. And the photo filter is basically emulating a creative filter on your lens. And we have all of these different preset styles. If you click this more, there's quite a few in here. And if you look at any of these names, you'll probably recognize them as filter names. Like you have ND Grad here, you have orange, you have a polarizer, and all of these different colors that you can use to modify the look. I typically like to stick with this ND Grad, this polarizer, and this warm polarizer. I personally love this warm polarizer. If I turn this warm polarizer on, and I turn this off and on, it does an awesome job of removing some of that haze in these mountains, bringing in some detail in here. And I can go in and I can actually modify a lot of these different options. So if I do want to change the color, I can choose the different color. I can modify the hue. I can bring in more of the amount. So if I want more of that, I can increase the saturation. And I can also bring in a little bit more of that polarizing look, which is kind of just removing some of that haze, but it works. Also, let's just go back to that polarizer filter, or warm polarizer, sorry. Also, I can choose what my filter type is. So if I want a graduated filter, I can choose that. Or if I want a bicolor filter, or if I want the filter to be applied in the center, I can choose that. I typically like to stick with solid because I can always go in and I can brush out the areas that I don't want it to be applied to. All right, so that's photo filter. Hope you guys are keeping up. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to hit up that Q&A and I'll try to get to those while we're kind of cruising along here. All right, so next filter is sharpening. Oops, let me zoom out. Okay, so for this photo, it probably doesn't need a ton of detail or dynamic contrast. But let's say we're trying to print this photo. Well, if we're trying to print this shot, we're gonna wanna add in some sharpening. And also I'd like to bring in some sharpening just so that these mountains are a little bit more pronounced in the frame. So let's add a filter. I'm just gonna add sharpening. So you'll see right away that if I turn this off and on, it sharpens those mountains right up, brings in a lot of detail to this photo, and adds some nice contrast. So sometimes, I know not all of the time, but sometimes with a photo like this, you know, just a well-taken shot, not a whole lot that needs to be done, you don't really have to add in dynamic contrast or HDR look or structure to bring in detail. Just head over and add a sharpening filter, and once I turn that off and on, that's about all I need for this photo to bring in detail. There's probably not a whole lot I want to do other than that to bring in some contrast to these mountains. And also in the sharpening filter, you can use these different preset styles to actually modify the filter for whatever you're doing. For example, if you are printing, you can choose this preset style. You can choose this preset style here. If you're trying to view it on a screen and say you're giving a presentation or something, you can choose that preset style here. Or what I like to do is I just click Fix Focus. And I'd say that fixed pretty much the focus in my photo. All right, so that's sharpening. Okay, so now we're on skin retouching, so let's move on to a portrait here. All right, so this is Bella. I'm just gonna go into develop and I'm gonna pull up on her exposure a little bit. And maybe the midtones. Okay, so let's go into effects and we want to apply some skin retouching. So if I zoom in on her face, there's not a whole lot wrong with it at all, but there's some minor imperfections and little blemishes we could clean up. So I'll add a filter, I'll add skin retouching, and now if I go in, I can actually modify the smoothing of the skin, the removal of the blemishes, and the removal of the shine simply by using these different sliders. Where I like to begin though, is I like to go in and grab my skin color first. So I'm gonna go in, I'm gonna grab my skin color, I'm just gonna drop it on a neutral area of skin, and I'm gonna go up and I'm gonna choose strong. Oops, that took her skin color away. Okay, so I'm gonna choose strong, and then I'll click on this dropper and I'll drop it on her skin. There we go. So now if I turn this off and on, does an awesome job of smoothing out that skin around her face. I can also play with the blemishes, so if I want to modify the blemishes to remove more or have more smoothing, I can do that with these sliders. Another great feature is if there's a lot of shine or there's some bright highlights on your model's face, you can use this to remove some of that shine. And we can also play with the evenness. And down here is our range. So this is going to choose how much or how little of the skin color that we want to bring in. Now the range slider, if I pull up on it, it's going to give you kind of a wonky look. But this is just showing you where you have those, all the skin color, where that's at on your photo and where that's being applied to. With the skin retouching filter, I would recommend going in to your masking options, selecting invert, then zooming in on the face, hitting B on your keyboard, making it to paint in, and now you can brush that skin retouching on without it being applied to any hair, teeth, or things that need detail. All right, so let's go out of this photo here and we'll keep moving on. Okay, so now let's move on to this photo. And I'll just go into develop. And I think we're good. Okay, so the next two filters we have, they're about probably my top 3 favorite filters for sure. Number 1 has to be either sunshine or dynamic contrast. But we'll add a filter. And the next one is this split tone filter. And like I was talking about earlier with the, I can't remember, the cross process filter, bleach bypass, I can't remember. One of the filters we were adding in split toning. So for the split tone filter, this is gonna be your, your dual tone style look. So let's add split tone. And the reason I like split toning is because you're basically choosing a color for your highlights and your shadows. This kind of gives you a lot of control over the tonality in your photo because you can choose all of these different options for those colors. One of my favorites is warm, for sure, because it brings in a nice warm look to the photo. You'll notice that when I click any of these styles, it's changing the different colors for my highlights and my shadows. Well, I can go in and I can swap them if I like. I can also go into my highlights and I can choose a different color. I can modify the hue. I can bring more or less in. I can use my balance to make it look more natural or less natural. And I can also do the same thing to my shadows. Also down here is your mode option. This is where you can choose the different blending modes for that split tone. The regular one is normal, but it kind of gives you a faded look on your shot. So sometimes I'll go down and I'll use this color option so that it's strictly being applied to the color in my photo. Turn that one off. And what else do we have here? Oh, we have sunshine. So we'll add a filter and we'll add sunshine. And sunshine is definitely top 3 favorite filters of all time. It basically emulates a sunshine look. It's darkening the darker areas in your photo and it's brightening the brighter areas. So if I turn this off and on, you'll see it brings in a little bit of a sunshine look. And I can go in and I can bring in more of that look. I can also play with the warmth. So if I want a cooler look on my photo, I can use this. Or if I want it to be warmer, I can head over to the warmer side. We also have saturation right here. So if I want to bring in more color or remove some, I can do that here. And there's also glow. So if you do want to add in a little bit of a glow, you can do that by using this. Some of my favorite preset styles in here are this sun glow and then this sunshine. I really like sun glow though. That's one filter. That's in develop, nothing applied, and one filter. And it's basically ready to go. Okay, so we're done with that filter here. Let's move on. We have 4 more filters. So let me grab another photo. And if you were with us last week, we worked on this photo a little bit, but it does really well with these 2 other filters. So I'm sorry if you're looking at it twice, but we're just gonna have to modify it today. And the same thing, basically I'm gonna go into my camera profile, it's on ON1 landscape, and I don't have anything else modified. Now I can go into effects, and the other filter we're gonna add is textures. And textures is an awesome filter, especially if you're trying to come up with a moody look or a grungy look, or you're making your photo look antique or bringing in historic, whatever you want to do to your shot. Textures is an awesome way to bring on different components and elements without actually applying layers. So inside our textures filter here, we have these preset styles here. One of my favorites here is grunge. And then down here we have our textures where we can choose the category. And there's going to be all of these different preset categories inside Photo RAW. Once you find one, you can just click on it. And then inside that texture, you'll have all of those textures that were there with that metal category. And we can also change the mode. So if we want to make it subtle, we can use that. If we want to replace the entire photo, we can do that. We can make it darker. I tend to like to stick with normal. And then I can lower the opacity of it or raise it however I want to do it. You also have tone and color down here. So if you want to brighten up that filter, you can do that. Add any saturation. And you can invert the look so that it's not the other way. Anyway, so let's uninvert this, and I'm actually just gonna grab sorry, where was that one that I like? Oh, we'll do scratched. There we go. Nice scratched film there. So now in here, I'm actually gonna colorize this, but I want it to be colored sort of a light yellowish color. Red maybe? There we go. And now I can change the amount so it's not so red. And if I pull up on this, oops. There we go. So now if I turn this off and on, we've added a nice little texture onto our photo. Textures go really well with two things. They go really well with more textures, and they go really well with borders. So if you want to add more textures, just keep adding more textures and you'll eventually come up with a look. Keep in mind that you do want to go in and sometimes you want to brush in or brush out some of that texture. Like with this photo, this subject area right here, it has a ton of textures on it already, so you're probably not going to be seeing a lot of those textures. But this area in our sky is a little bit more flat, so you can see all of those textures on there. So if you do have a subject that's a little bit more like this sky area, you're probably going to have to brush some of that out. Just to keep in mind. Okay, so that's textures. And then we have three more. We have tone enhancer now. And tone enhancer is basically your tonality adjustments inside Develop. So inside tone and color, we have all of these different sliders. We have exposure, contrast, highlights. Kind of the main ones. Well, inside this tone enhancer, that's kind of all of those in this filter so that you can mask and brush it on and blend it in. So if I want to pull up on the exposure, I can do that here. Contrast. I can pull up on the shadows, blacks. Keep in mind, and I've had a lot of questions about this, the tone enhancer isn't the tone enhancer isn't modifying all of that raw data in your photo. It's modifying some because it is a filter and they do modify raw data and they modify the different pixels in your image. But to get all of that raw data in your photo modified, use the tone and color inside of Develop. Even though you can't mask and blend it, it's going to give you a stronger effect than with this filter. But you can always go down, and there's a few cool things in tone enhancer. You can modify the compression. Remember that was that sort of HDR look. See how if I pull up on that, it's bringing out more of those shadow details and making this image look like it was shot with HDR. And then we can also modify clarity to bring in some detail. And then below that we have our curve slider, or our tone curve, sorry. So now we have our tone curve, and we can do the same things we did earlier and kind of bring in different looks to the photo. All right. So the last couple filters here, we have vignette, which actually, okay, I take it back. This might be in my top 3 also. I do love the vignette filter. And the vignette filter is to create a vignette on your photo. And I typically like to stick with this big softy preset. It does a nice job of kind of making it less subtle, but also not strong enough to where it's, you know, blacking out these corners. And then we can go in and we can modify the brightness. So if you want it brighter, you can modify the size, the feathering, if you want a tighter feathering, and then the roundness. And then this type down here, you can modify the different type of it. So there's normal, which is pretty strong. There's subtle, which is what I like to stick with. There's soft, which is a little bit stronger than subtle. And then there's priority, which is more similar to the vignetting in, or the highlight priority vignetting in Lightroom. But I'll just stick with Big Softy. All right, so that's vignette. And then we have one last filter, and it's vintage. And vintage, I like to think of it as antique with color. It's kind of like some of your antique filters where they have that sort of aged look, but they're bringing in a little bit more color with these ones. So inside of our vintage, we can choose these different preset options in here, and then we can choose our color. So I'm actually gonna go in and I'm gonna choose this lo-fi, and I'm gonna go into my color. And I typically like to use kind of random colors every now and then. Let's just use earth. And let's pull up on the amount. There we go, bringing some nice warmth to the photo. Maybe add the saturation. Yeah, let's bring in some saturation. Let's make it more vintage than that. There we go. That's a little more vintage. Oof, that's awful. This might be one of those times where I have to go in and I have to really play with the opacity. Let's just use earth and see if we can make it amazing. There we go. Okay, it's not doing too bad. That's actually not bad. Just a nice little vintage filter on our photo, make it look a little bit more old. So that's the vintage filter. And so those are all of the filters inside Effects, inside Photo RAW. Are there any questions before we wrap up here? I know it went a little bit over. It's about an hour and 13 minutes, but there's a lot of filters to go over. So are there any questions before we wrap up here? Thanks, John. Appreciate it, man. All right, guys. Well, no further questions. Really appreciate you guys signing up and staying with me the whole time. Thanks so much, and stay tuned. We are going to be having more webinars every week, so feel free to sign up for any of those, and I'll see you guys next week. Thanks, guys.